You know what they say about the Galactic University's Advanced Mathematics final exam? Actually no, you probably don't know what they say, because what they say would make a grown Krillian weep purple tears of despair. The exam is legendary across 17 star systems, whispered about in the darkest corners of academic forums, and has single-handedly been responsible for more career changes than the great economic collapse of Sector 7. Jake Martinez, however, was not particularly impressed by any of this. While his classmates huddled in study groups that resembled grief counseling sessions more than academic preparation, Jake sat in the back of Professor Krelix's lecture hall, doodling spaceships in his notebook margins and wondering if the cafeteria still had those weird blue nuggets that tasted suspiciously like chicken. The fact that he was the only human in a class of 43 alien students didn't bother him much. What bothered him was how seriously everyone else took everything. Take Nix for instance. The poor Arcturian had been stress molting for 3 weeks, leaving little piles of silver scales everywhere he went. His normally pristine blue skin had turned a sickly green, and his 4 eyes had developed a perpetual twitch that made conversations with him feel like watching a broken hologram. Jake Nix whispered, his voice cracking like a 13-year-old going through puberty. Have you started reviewing the 17-dimensional calculus yet? Because I've been at it for 72 hours straight, and I think I can feel my brain leaking out of my ears. Jake glanced over at his study materials, which consisted of exactly 1 notebook with about half the pages actually used. Oh yeah, totally. I'm all over that 17-dimensional stuff. Really getting into the dimensions of it all. Across the aisle, Korth the Magnificent, who despite his name was roughly the size and shape of an anxious potato, was rocking back and forth while clutching a data pad to his chest. His 3-fingered hands were shaking so badly that the screen kept flickering between equations and what appeared to be a meditation app. We're all going to fail, Korth muttered. We're all going to fail spectacularly and become cautionary tales told to future students. They'll name the failure after us. The Korth effect. The Nix phenomenon. The great academic disaster of cycle 2847. Jake looked around the lecture hall at the 42 aliens in various states of mathematical panic. Some were hyperventilating, which was particularly entertaining when the student in question had 17 different breathing appendages. Others were engaged in what could only be described as academic self-harm, repeatedly solving practice problems that were clearly above their skill level just to watch themselves fail. And then there was Jake, who honestly couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. Math was math, right? Numbers were numbers. How hard could it possibly be? He was about to find out that sometimes, the most dangerous question in the universe is exactly that one. Professor Krelix was what you might call a mathematical legend. If legends were typically 4-armed, purple, and had a tendency to speak in equations when they got excited. The Zentorian had spent the better part of 3 centuries, developing what he modestly called the most intellectually challenging examination in known space. Students who had survived encounters with Krelix's exam were treated like war veterans. Those who hadn't were usually found in padded rooms, muttering about imaginary numbers and crying softly. Jake's roommate Blorg was one of the survivors, though the term survivor might have been generous. The slug-like creature had taken Krelix's exam 2 years ago, and still woke up screaming about mathematical theorems that didn't exist. You don't understand, Blorg said, his eye stalks waggling with barely contained terror as he paced around their dorm room. Well, paced was probably the wrong word, since Blorg didn't have legs, but he did that thing where he undulated back and forth in increasingly agitated patterns. Professor Krelix doesn't just test your knowledge, he tests your soul. He reaches into the very core of your being, and examines whether you're worthy of calling yourself a mathematician. Jake looked up from his gaming console, where he was currently losing badly to a 10-year-old from the Vega system, in something called Quantum Tetris. Dude, it's just a test. Multiple choice, right? Blorg's entire body quivered with what Jake had learned to recognize as existential dread. Multiple choice. Jake, my friend, you clearly don't understand the magnitude of what you're facing. This isn't multiple choice. This is a single question. One question, Jake. One question that has broken the minds of students who went on to design faster-than-light engines and solve the unified field theory. What happened to that guy Vex you mentioned? Jake asked, pausing his game because he was genuinely curious now. Vex the Brilliant. Blorg's voice dropped to a whisper. Vex the once brilliant, you mean? He was the top student in 17 different mathematical disciplines. His doctoral thesis on 11-dimensional space folding was so advanced that 3 professors had nervous breakdowns just trying to understand the abstract. When he walked into Professor Krelix's exam, he was confident, prepared, ready to tackle anything the universe could throw at him. Jake waited for the punchline, but Blorg just stared at the wall with his eye stalks pointing in different directions. and now he runs a small fruit stand on Kepler 442b, and hasn't spoken a number higher than 12 in 2 years. He twitches whenever someone mentions addition. Jake blinked. That's actually kind of sad. It's not sad, Jake. It's terrifying. And tomorrow you're going to walk into that same room, face the same impossible question, and probably join Vex in the fruit business. No offense. Jake shrugged and went back to his game. I've always liked fruit. The Great Hall of Mathematical Enlightenment, which was either named by someone with a sense of irony, or someone who had never actually experienced mathematical enlightenment, looked more like a torture chamber than an examination venue. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, decorated with floating holographic equations that writhed and twisted like mathematical snakes. The walls were lined with portraits of famous mathematicians from across the galaxy, all of whom seemed to be staring down at the exam tables with expressions of deep disappointment. Jake arrived 15 minutes early, which was approximately 14 minutes and 50 seconds later than everyone else. The other students had apparently been camping out since dawn, clutching Lucky Charms and whispering what sounded like mathematical prayers to various numerical deities. Nix was there, of course, now completely bald from stress molting and looking like a very sad, very blue chicken. Korth had brought what appeared to be an entire pharmacy worth of anxiety medication and was methodically working his way through them in alphabetical order. The seating arrangement was pure psychological warfare. 43 individual desks were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, each one positioned so that students could see exactly how badly everyone else was panicking. Jake found his assigned seat in the third ring of the spiral and settled in, noting that the desk was made from some kind of black metal that absorbed heat and made everything feel vaguely ominous. At exactly 0900 hours Galactic Standard Time, the massive doors at the front of the hall burst open with a sound like thunder mixed with the screams of failed mathematics students. Professor Krelix entered, and Jake had to admit, the guy knew how to make an entrance. 4 arms, each one ending in hands that seemed to have too many fingers, moved in perfectly synchronized gestures as Krelix glided across the floor. His purple skin seemed to shimmer under the harsh examination lights, and his 6 eyes swept across the assembled students like searchlights looking for signs of weakness. He was wearing traditional Zentorian academic robes, which looked like someone had taken a graduation gown and decided it needed more dramatic flair and approximately 30% more fabric. Students, Professor Krelix began, his voice carrying easily across the cavernous hall without any amplification. Jake was pretty sure the guy had some kind of built-in speaker system. Today, you face the ultimate test of mathematical comprehension. For 3 centuries, this examination has separated the merely intelligent from the truly enlightened. It has revealed the difference between those who memorize formulas and those who understand the fundamental poetry of numbers. A student in the front row, some kind of crystalline being whose name Jake had never learned, began making a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. This was apparently how his species wept. The question before you, Krelix continued, clearly enjoying the growing panic, represents the culmination of advanced mathematical theory across 17 different disciplines. It incorporates elements of quantum mechanics, 11-dimensional geometry, temporal calculus, and theoretical impossibility studies. Many of you will look upon this question and feel your minds rebel against its complexity. Jake glanced around and noticed that at least 6 students had already begun hyperventilating. One had fainted entirely, and was being quietly removed by medical drones. You have exactly 1 hour, Krelix announced, producing a stack of examination papers that seemed to glow with an ominous light. The question is worth 100% of your final grade. There are no partial points. There is no extra credit. There is only success, or the kind of failure that echoes through the corridors of academic history. As the papers were distributed by hovering drones that moved with funeral solemnity, Jake could hear the sound of 42 different species discovering new and creative ways to express terror. There was weeping, wailing, the grinding of teeth, and what sounded like someone trying to pray in a language that consisted entirely of mathematical constants. When Jake's exam paper finally floated down to his desk, he looked around one more time at his classmates. Nix was staring at his paper with the expression of someone who had just been asked to defuse a bomb using only a spoon and good intentions. Korth appeared to be having some kind of religious experience, possibly involving a conversion to a faith that didn't require mathematics. Jake flipped over his exam paper, expecting to see some kind of mind-bending equation that would require him to invent new forms of mathematics just to understand the question. Instead, he found himself looking at a 9x9 grid with some numbers already filled in. Jake stared at the paper for a full 30 seconds, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely this was just the first page. Surely there was more. Surely the most terrifying mathematical examination in galactic history wasn't just this. He flipped the paper over. Blank. He flipped it back. Still a 9x9 grid with numbers scattered throughout in what was clearly a deliberate pattern. Jake had to bite his lip to keep from laughing out loud. This wasn't advanced mathematics. This wasn't 11-dimensional geometry, or temporal calculus, or whatever theoretical impossibility studies were supposed to be. This was a Sudoku puzzle. A completely standard, bog-standard, could buy it at any gas station on Earth Sudoku puzzle. The same type of puzzle his grandmother worked on during her morning coffee. The same puzzle that appeared in every newspaper from New York to New Tokyo. The same puzzle that phone apps used as filler content and that airplane magazines printed to keep passengers occupied during turbulence. Around him, the sounds of mathematical terror continued to escalate. Someone in the back row was now speaking in tongues, though Jake was pretty sure the tongues were ancient mathematical dialects. Nix had begun rocking back and forth so violently that his desk was starting to scoot across the floor. A student 3 seats over had apparently decided that the best approach to the impossible question was to stare at it until either enlightenment struck or his brain leaked out of his ears. Jake looked more closely at the grid, running through the basic Sudoku rules in his head. Each row needed to contain the digits 1 through 9 exactly once. Each column needed the same. Each of the 9 3x3 boxes needed all 9 digits. It was puzzle logic 101, the kind of thing Earth kids learned when they were bored and had exhausted all other forms of entertainment. The irony was almost too much to handle. Here were some of the brightest minds from across the galaxy. Students who had mastered faster-than-light physics and quantum engineering. Students who could calculate orbital mechanics in their heads and design wormhole generators for fun. And they were being defeated by a puzzle that Earth classified as moderate difficulty, and sold in books labeled perfect for the bathroom. Jake started filling in the obvious numbers first, the way any decent Sudoku solver would. In the top left box, there was clearly a 7 that belonged in the middle row, since every other position already had conflicts. Basic elimination. In the center box, the 5 had to go in the bottom right corner because, well, where else could it go? As he worked, Jake became increasingly aware of just how absurd this whole situation was. Somewhere in the background of his consciousness, he could hear Professor Krelix pacing between the desks, his 4 arms moving in what were probably meant to be intimidating mathematical gestures, but now just looked like someone trying to conduct an orchestra of panic. The puzzle wasn't even that hard, by Earth standards. Maybe a 3 out of 5 difficulty rating. The kind of thing that appeared in Sunday newspapers under the heading moderately challenging right next to the crossword puzzle and the horoscopes. Jake had solved harder Sudokus while waiting in line at the grocery store. He filled in another number, then another. The logic was straightforward, almost soothing. Find the constraints, eliminate the impossible options, work through the remaining possibilities systematically. It was the same logical process humans had been using for decades to solve these puzzles, except apparently no one else in the galaxy had figured it out yet. Jake paused for a moment to appreciate the full scope of the situation. Earth, a planet that most of the galaxy considered to be populated by primitive warmongers who had barely figured out space travel, had accidentally created the perfect training program for the most advanced mathematics course in known space. Every newspaper puzzle, every phone app game, every bored moment spent with a pencil and a grid had been preparing humanity for this exact moment. His grandmother, who had never graduated high school but could solve a Sunday Sudoku in under 20 minutes, was apparently more mathematically advanced than graduate students from civilizations that had been exploring space for millennia. The thought was so ridiculous that Jake had to cover his mouth to hide his grin. Around him, 42 of the galaxy's brightest students continued their descent into mathematical madness, completely unaware that they were being defeated by the intellectual equivalent of a children's coloring book. Jake settled into a comfortable rhythm, the kind of methodical progression that came from years of casual puzzle solving. Top row, second column obviously needed a 4, middle left box was missing a 6 in only one possible position. The center square had to be a 9 because every other number was already accounted for in that row and column. It was almost meditative, really. While chaos erupted around him, Jake found himself in that pleasant zone that serious Sudoku solvers knew well, where logic flowed naturally and numbers fell into place with satisfying inevitability. He discovered this zone during particularly boring lectures back on Earth, when professors droned on about subjects that somehow managed to make calculus seem exciting by comparison. About 10 minutes in, he noticed Professor Krelix's pacing had slowed considerably. The Zentorian's 6 eyes kept drifting toward Jake's desk with what appeared to be growing confusion. Jake supposed it made sense. While everyone else was either catatonic with terror or actively weeping onto their exam papers, he was calmly filling in numbers with the casual confidence of someone solving a word search. Nix, meanwhile, had progressed from rocking back and forth to making small whimpering sounds that reminded Jake of a broken air conditioning unit. His stress molting had accelerated to the point where he was leaving a small pile of blue scales every time he shifted position. At this rate, he'd be completely bald and probably need to be scraped off the floor with a spatula. "This is impossible," someone whispered from the front row. "The mathematical complexity is beyond comprehension. How do you even begin to approach 17-dimensional calculus when you can't visualize more than 3 dimensions?" Jake glanced up from his puzzle, genuinely puzzled. 17-dimensional what now? He looked back down at his grid. Nope, still just a Sudoku. Still just 9 rows, 9 columns, and 9 boxes. Still just the numbers 1 through 9. He was starting to wonder if everyone else had gotten a different exam, except he could clearly see that all the papers looked identical. Row 7 was coming together nicely. The 8 had to go in position 4, which meant the 3 went in position 6, which opened up the entire bottom right box for completion. Jake filled in the remaining numbers with the kind of systematic efficiency that would have made his high school math teacher proud, if his high school math teacher had ever bothered to notice that Jake was actually pretty good at logical reasoning when it didn't involve memorizing formulas. 20 minutes in, and Jake was down to the final few squares. This was always the most satisfying part of any Sudoku, when the remaining possibilities narrowed down to inevitable conclusions and the whole grid suddenly snapped into focus like a completed jigsaw puzzle. Behind him, someone was having what sounded like a full psychological breakdown. "The numbers, they're mocking me," a voice wailed. "They're arranged in patterns that suggest infinite complexity, but every time I try to grasp the underlying theorem, it slips away like quantum foam." Jake blinked. Quantum foam. He looked at his grid again, wondering if maybe he was missing something. But no, it was still just a Sudoku. The same type of logic puzzle that humans had been mass-producing for entertainment purposes since the early 21st century. The same puzzle that appeared in children's activity books right next to connect the dots and word searches. Professor Krelix had stopped pacing entirely now and was standing about 10 feet away, his forearms crossed in what was either deep contemplation or the Zentorian equivalent of a nervous breakdown. His 6 eyes were all focused on Jake with an intensity that was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable. Jake decided to ignore the attention and focus on finishing his puzzle. Bottom left corner needed a 2, which meant the 7 went in the middle, which meant, done. He leaned back and admired his completed Sudoku. Every row contained the numbers 1 through 9 exactly once. Every column contained the numbers 1 through 9 exactly once. Every 3x3 box contained the numbers 1 through 9 exactly once. It was a thing of simple, logical beauty. Jake checked his watch. 26 minutes. Not his personal best, but respectable for what had apparently been classified as the most difficult mathematical challenge in galactic history. Around him, the sounds of academic despair continued unabated. Korth had moved on from anxiety medication to what appeared to be some kind of Gregorian chanting, though the words seemed to be mathematical constants rather than traditional religious phrases. Someone in the back row was banging their head gently against their desk in rhythm with their sobs. Jake looked at his completed puzzle one more time, then at the clock on the wall showing 34 minutes remaining in the exam period. He supposed he could double-check his work, but honestly, it was pretty straightforward. Every number was exactly where it needed to be, according to basic Sudoku rules. He raised his hand. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every sound in the Great Hall of Mathematical Enlightenment stopped as if someone had hit a cosmic mute button. 42 alien students turned to stare at Jake with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror to what might have been religious awe. Professor Krelix's 6 eyes widened until they looked like purple dinner plates. "Yes, Mr. Martinez." Professor Krelix's voice was carefully controlled, but Jake could hear the underlying tension. This was clearly not part of the normal examination protocol. "I'm done," Jake said, holding up his completed paper with the same casual confidence he might use to order a coffee. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake was pretty sure he could have heard a pin drop on the other side of the galaxy. Professor Krelix approached Jake's desk with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who suspected they were about to witness either a miracle or a complete mental breakdown. His forearms moved independently as he walked, 2 reaching toward Jake's paper while the other 2 seemed to be making nervous gestures that probably meant something in Zentorian body language but looked to Jake like someone trying to swat invisible flies. "You believe you have completed the examination, Mr. Martinez?" Professor Krelix's voice carried a mixture of skepticism and what might have been hope. After 3 centuries of watching students dissolve into gibbering mathematical wrecks, he probably wasn't sure what to make of someone who looked like they'd just finished a particularly enjoyable crossword puzzle. Yeah, pretty much, Jake said, offering the paper with the same casual attitude he'd used to hand over a grocery list. It's a Sudoku. You fill in the missing numbers so each row, column and box has all the digits from 1 to 9 exactly once. Takes a bit of logic, but it's not too bad once you get the hang of it. The word Sudoku seemed to hit the assembled aliens like a physical force. Several students gasped, though Jake wasn't entirely sure how you gasp when your respiratory system involves gills. Nix made a sound like a deflating balloon, and Korth actually fell off his chair, which was impressive considering he was roughly spherical and had seemed pretty stable up until that moment. Professor Krelix took the paper with the reverence usually reserved for ancient religious artifacts or possibly unexploded ordnance. His 6 eyes scanned the completed grid, checking each row, each column, each box with the methodical precision of someone who had spent centuries perfecting the art of academic humiliation. This is... Professor Krelix began, then stopped. His purple skin seemed to shift through several different shades, which Jake was pretty sure meant something significant in Zentorian emotional expression, but looked like someone adjusting the color settings on a television. Correct, Professor Krelix finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The great hall of mathematical enlightenment erupted into chaos. Not the organized academic chaos of students panicking over a difficult exam, but the raw primal chaos of 42 different species, simultaneously discovering that their entire understanding of advanced mathematics had been fundamentally wrong. Nix began laughing hysterically, a sound that started as a high-pitched giggle and quickly escalated into something that sounded like a broken saxophone being played by someone having a seizure. His stress molting reached critical levels, and he started shedding scales so rapidly that it looked like it was snowing inside the examination hall. Korth, from his position on the floor, began speaking in what appeared to be mathematical tongues. Sudoku, he repeated over and over, like a mantra, or possibly an incantation. Sudoku, Sudoku, the human speaks of Sudoku. How? Professor Krelix demanded, his 4 hands now gesturing wildly in Jake's direction. How did you solve the infinite complexity matrix? How did you penetrate the 17-dimensional mathematical barrier that has defeated the greatest minds in galactic history? Jake scratched his head, genuinely confused by the question. I mean, it's just pattern recognition, right? You look at what's missing, eliminate the impossible options, and fill in what's left. My grandmother taught me when I was like 12. She had this book of puzzles she'd work on during commercials when she was watching her soap operas. The mention of Jake's grandmother seemed to break something fundamental in Professor Krelix's worldview. The Zentorian's 6 eyes all focused on Jake with an intensity that was starting to feel genuinely uncomfortable. Your grandmother, Professor Krelix repeated slowly, as if the words were physically painful to say. A human grandmother solved the infinite complexity matrix. Well, she never called it that, Jake said. She just called them Sudokus. Said they were good for keeping your brain sharp. She could do the Sunday paper ones in like 15 minutes while she was drinking her coffee and complaining about the neighbors. The great hall had gone quiet again, but this time it was the quiet of minds collectively breaking. Jake could practically hear the sound of long-held beliefs crumbling and academic careers imploding. Mr. Martinez, Professor Krelix said, his voice now carrying the hollow tone of someone who had just realized that their life's work had been rendered meaningless by a human grandmother and a book of bathroom puzzles. Are you telling me that this mathematical challenge, which has been the pinnacle of academic achievement for 3 centuries, is considered entertainment on your planet? Jake nodded cheerfully. Oh yeah, totally. You can buy books of them at any gas station. They print them in newspapers. There are phone apps. My little cousin does them on her tablet while she's waiting for her juice box to warm up. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This was the silence of an entire academic institution, realizing that they had been defeated not by superior intelligence or advanced mathematical theory, but by what was essentially the galactic equivalent of a children's coloring book. Professor Krelix slowly sank into his chair, his forearms hanging limply at his sides. His carefully maintained academic dignity crumbled like a house of cards in a windstorm. 3 centuries of intellectual superiority, gone. His reputation as the galaxy's most challenging mathematics professor, destroyed by a human who had learned to solve impossible mathematical puzzles from his grandmother while she watched soap operas. Jake looked around at the devastated faces of his classmates and felt a moment of genuine sympathy. They weren't bad people, just academics who had built their entire identities around being the smartest beings in the known universe. Finding out that their greatest intellectual challenge was considered casual entertainment by a species they'd probably classified as quaint, had to be a bit of a blow to the ego. "Look," Jake said, trying to be helpful, "if you want I could teach you guys how to do them. They're actually pretty fun once you get the hang of it. We could start with the easy ones and work our way up. I've got a whole app on my phone with like 10,000 puzzles." The offer was met with a collective groan that seemed to echo through the hall like the sound of dreams dying. Jake shrugged and gathered up his things. He had a feeling that Professor Krelix's advanced mathematics course was about to undergo some significant curriculum changes. As he walked toward the exit, Jake couldn't help but smile. Wait until he told his grandmother that her Sunday morning puzzle habit had accidentally made her one of the most mathematically advanced beings in the galaxy. She was going to get such a kick out of that.